Welcome to Breaking Ties. Is Divorce the Answer? This is your go-to source for practical advice and support when considering if a divorce is the right answer for you. Join us each weekday for a quick chat where we'll uncover a variety of topics such as child custody, property division, and self-care. Together, we'll explore the emotional, financial, and legal aspects of divorce and help you find the best path forward for you and your family. Here is your host and certified divorce financial analyst professional, Mike Fulkerson.
Welcome to the Breaking Ties interview series, where we talk with a professional who assists those getting through the divorce process and answers many of the common questions you may have. I'm your host, Mike Fulkerson, and with me today is Marson Maynor. Marson is a loan officer with Geneva Financial and has a tremendous amount of knowledge with mortgages. Welcome to the podcast, Marson.
Hey, man. Thanks for having me.
How you doing today?
I'm doing great, dude. Looking forward to sharing some knowledge.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. And so for our listeners, really what we're doing is a 5-part series this week on mortgages and divorce. So each day is going to be a different set of questions for you to listen to and fill in some of the gaps you might have with regards to how the process works and what happens and takes place during the divorce process. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. You ready, Marson?
You betcha, man. Bring it.
All right. Question number 1 today. What happens to the marital home in a divorce?
So obviously, it's going to depend a lot about how the divorce decree is laid out and the negotiations between the spouses on what happens. But typically, there's two real things that will happen. Either you sell the property and get those proceeds back and then divvy those up if that's part of the divorce negotiation, or continue to own the property and determine, if both parties will still live in the house or if only one of the spouse will live in the house. Obviously, if there's kids involved, that is a whole dynamic of its own, other than just two spouses splitting. You have to, consider the kids and schools and all that other kind of stuff. So typically it just depends on what, is done through the negotiation and then the divorce decree, which will determine what will be the situation for the home, if you will.
Right. Yeah. There are a ton of variables that go into what's going to happen to the house in the divorce kind of thing. Now, one of the interesting caveats and that someone asked was, can a couple continue to co-own the house after the divorce?
Absolutely. So, going through a divorce is got its own specific, challenges and agreements that need to be thought out and discussed. When it comes to a mortgage, you've already done it. You've signed the loan paperwork, you've signed the mortgage paperwork, you've got the name and title. Under the lenders, if you will, the lender doesn't really care about, what you do or what somebody does as far as a divorce goes. All they care about is getting their payments back, getting the payments made for the money that they borrowed. So the lender really don't have a requirement as to what needs to happen during divorce or after divorce. They just want to make sure that payments are being made and being made on time. If they need to change that up, then they could definitely talk to their servicer, their current person they're making more payments to, or they can talk to a lending professional, and then they can talk about what different avenues they can have going down that road, for sure.
Huh. Wow, great information right there.
Yeah.
And as a couple makes their way through the divorce process, there's that division of assets that you had talked about earlier, and how the negotiations take place. How is the home's value determined for property division?
Typically, if you're going to divide the property, meaning you're going to sell the property and then whatever remaining proceeds are left over, split that up, then if you hire a real estate agent will do their due diligence and determine comparative market values on similar homes, to the home that's in question. And then they'll list that property. And then ultimately, once that property is sold, whatever the agreed sales price is, that will be the factor that's being used by taking out any liens against the property, cleaning up any mortgages, any past due taxes, anything like that, and then paying any, closing fees, realtor commissions, whatever is left over from that that number then would be divvied up depending on how the divorce decree reads: 50-50, 60-40, 70-30, yada yada. It just depends on what that is. That's if they're going to sell. If they're thinking of keeping the home, then depending on if which one of the spouses is going to retain the home, they would want to then talk to their own lender, because what's going to happen is they're going to want to refinance the other spouse off, so that spouse can be separated from the ownership, separated from the legal responsibility of making payments, and then they'll also be able to open up that part of their budget, so to speak, so that they can go qualify and possibly purchasing a home on their own if that's what they're looking to do.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when we look at, values, it's no different than any other asset. It's going to have
Right.
its own value, and whether or not you're underwater or not underwater, or if there's a lot of equity or little equity, is all up for discussion during the process.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as a couple goes through the divorce process, who's responsible for the mortgage?
All the lender cares about, all the servicer cares about, is whoever's name is on the promissory note, the document that they signed at closing stating that they're responsible for monthly payments. If it's both spouses, then the servicer doesn't care if money comes from either one or from a joint account. From a divorce standpoint, that's something that might be part of the negotiation. But at the end of the day, if, let's say, it's determined that spouse A is both spouses are on the mortgage, but spouse A is no longer going to be responsible due to what the courts say, the only way that spouse A can remove their obligation is by spouse B then refinancing into their name, or again go back to just selling the home and splitting whatever is left over, so to speak. So if the bottom line is whoever signed the promissory note stating that they're obligated to make those payments, that person is still obligated, and at least a payment a month needs to be made consistently on that. Otherwise, it will create a delinquent situation.
Right. Yeah. And we definitely don't want to do that. And that's a whole
No.
nother conversation on credit and qualifying and everything else that we're going to
Yes.
have later this week as we get through the questions for the interview series. And so this is going to wrap up day one here on the podcast. How you feel, Marson?
Good stuff, man. I feel good. I hope this is helpful for your listeners, and there's not one size fits all or one right answer for anyone, man. A divorce is its own set of challenges and things like that, and then when you start figuring out other assets and how those are going to play out, it creates much challenge. So the best thing to do is always reach out to a professional in that particular field and get get information that way. Even check with a few just to see what they say. That's all you can do, right?
Exactly. That's great advice.
Yeah.
So for our listeners, once again, this is going to be a week-long series of questions on mortgages and divorce, and we're going to have more discussion coming up. Marson and I would like to thank you for joining us today on the Breaking Ties interview series. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Should you have any questions for Marson, you can find his contact information in the podcast description. Until next time, remember, divorce is not the end of your story. It is the start of your next great chapter. Take care, everybody.
How we going?
Welcome to day 2 of the Breaking Ties interview series, where we talk with a professional who assists those going through the divorce process and answers many of the common questions you may have. As always, I'm your host, Mike Fulkerson, and with me today, again and back, is Marson Maynor. Welcome, Marson, to the show.
How's it going today?
I'm doing pretty good. So for our listeners, Marson is a loan officer with Geneva Financial and an expert in mortgages and the mortgage process. He's got a lot of experience to lean on. So we're going to try to get through that experience and share it with you today. You ready to go, Marson?
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me, buddy.
No problem. Glad you could join us. All right. So for our listeners, if you didn't catch yesterday's podcast, we went over 4 questions yesterday. You're going to want to catch that. They were good questions. It was great responses. So we're going to pick up with 4 different questions today, and we're going to get some more information. We're going to start with, can one spouse force the other to sell the house?
No spouse can say we have to do one thing or the other. But without both spouses coming to some form of an agreement, which one could be forced into choosing a certain way, um, they're going to be stuck. So they're going to have to figure out what's going to work best for them, either retaining the home or do they need to sell the home. No, those are really pretty much going to be the only two things, right? But as far as actually forcing, force is such a big word, I guess, because you can't force somebody to do their push-ups, but financially you could probably make it tighter for someone and that could hurt. So then that forces them to have to maybe lean towards one side of the decision that they maybe didn't want to do.
Right, exactly. The whole process is it's a negotiation when you're working on finishing off the divorce process and the marriage settlement agreement. So we get through the process, and what are the options for refinancing the mortgage once the divorce is finalized?
Good question, man. There's basically a couple. So the majority of it would be if they're going to retain the home, obviously, because if it's post divorce and they still have ownership of a property, the refinancing can be for a couple of different reasons. One spouse is going to retain; they just want to have the other spouse removed, so that way that spouse can go on and move on with their life, so to speak, buy a new home, whatever the case may be, a condo, it doesn't matter. But then there also might be another need for a refinance where you're cashing out some of that equity that may have been negotiated in the divorce negotiations, where depending on how long, what you paid for it, how long you've lived there, what you owe in it, there could be substantial equity that may need to be split up between the two parties. So the party that's going to be staying in the home would do what's called a cash out refinance, where they can access a portion of that equity. Let's just use an example of 50% ownership, right? So the one spouse is going to retain whatever mortgage it is, but let's say there's $100,000 in equity. They could refinance, get $50,000 out as long as the parameters work correctly from a qualifying standpoint. But then give that 50,000 to the other spouse so that then they can go and do what they need to do. So it's two pronged, because you want to, if they have ownership in the property, they need to be removed from the ownership, quit claim deed, all that kind of stuff, change the mortgage, change the title. And then also from a compensation, if you will, standpoint, where they can get some of the earned equity into their own pocket. So, make sense?
It does. That was very well done. Now, one of the things that most people often think about when they're going through the divorce process is their credit. So, do you have any tips on how people can protect their credit during the divorce process and the mortgage side of things as well? Yeah, well, yeah, that's fantastic advice right there. So, this actually concludes day 2 of our 5-day interview.
Wow.
Please join us tomorrow as we continue our discussion on mortgages and divorce. Marson and I would like to thank you for joining us today on the Breaking Ties interviews series. Should you have any questions for Marson, you can find his contact information in the description of the podcast. And remember, divorce is not the end of your story, it is the start of your next great chapter. We'll see you tomorrow. Welcome to the third day of the Breaking Ties interview series, where we talk with professionals who assist those getting people through the divorce process and answers many common questions that you might have. As always, I'm your host, Mike Fulkerson, and with me today again is our friend Marson Maynor. Marson is a loan officer with Geneva Financial and has a ton of experience in mortgages. Welcome back, Marson.
Thanks, man. Great to be here. Looking pretty sprite today.
You're not looking too bad yourself.
Right on, man. Thanks.
All right. So we're going to roll out the first question here for our listeners. And if our listeners hasn't picked up on the other two podcasts we've done, you're going to want to go back and listen to those because we had some really great questions that we went through, and Marson provided some excellent advice. So today we're going to start off with, how is the equity in the house divided between spouses?
Right on. So, pretty cut and dry. Just more of a math thing, really. Typically when going through the divorce process, let's just use, everybody's they're separating amicably, 50-50, right? We're just going to split everything down the middle. So let's just say they own a home together. Home is worth, 400,000. They have a $200,000 mortgage. They're like, okay, split the equity. So 100,000 each for the remaining two. And you also want to make sure that even though someone may be the way the negotiations go says that the other spouse should get X amount of money, you have to remember if because they're keeping the property. I mean, if they're selling, then it's just 50-50 of net proceeds and then they're done. But if they're retaining ownership of one of them is retaining ownership of the property, they're going to be limited on the maximum dollar or the maximum dollar percentage that they can withdraw from the house on a cash out refinance. So there's going to be some limitations. Sometimes it can be done, sometimes it can't. It just depends on what is negotiated, and then obviously how the house appraises, what they currently owe, and then affordability too. Because I think we mentioned this in a previous chat. Borrowing today is a little bit more expensive than it was even 2 years ago, and a lot of people took advantage of refinancing and have a low interest rate. Interest rates are not that low anymore. So retaining the property, trying to pull out that extra money, and now increasing the debt on the mortgage at a higher interest rate, it can all play a role in the ability to be able to do that. So sometimes you can't do it and you have to sell. So it just depends. But talk to a lender, get your questions answered.
Yeah. So we talk a lot about dividing up property and assets and stuff. And then you also talk about transferring ownership from one spouse to the other. Are there tax implications that you're aware of when transferring ownership of the home?
Not typically if one is basically just staying on property. Now, then this could be a completely unique situation, but possible where one spouse, they live together, but only one of them is on the mortgage. But based on their negotiation, the spouse that's not on or on the loan is not on the loan wants to retain the ownership, where they have to get a mortgage for themselves. Then that could create something because you're actually changing possibly the title of the ownership. So you're actually, the courts don't care who's changing hands, but if you're changing hands, sometimes there's repercussion based on a timeline. Like, for example, capital gains. You need to own the property for at least 2 years. So, and I'm again not an attorney, you'd want to check with them. But typically, let's say, 2 years ago, married couple bought a home, and now they're in the process. It's less than 2 years, let's say they're in the process now, and they're debating on what to do. Well, if they go sell the property, that could be one tax implication because they didn't wait the 2 years, but it may not hurt them to have one of them retain because it's still staying like within the family. So it's more of a tricky kind of question based on the specific scenario for them and how they're negotiating.
Right. Yes. And like you said, you're going to want to, talk with the attorney, but also you might enlist an accountant to help you out as well, just to make sure you're on the right side of those tax issues. So, an interesting question that has popped up is, what if the house is underwater? The mortgage balance exceeds the home value. Any thoughts on how that might play out?
Yeah, I mean you're already talking about being underwater, and nobody wants to be underwater no matter what, unless you got air. So, um, the short answer is you can do it. If you're not gonna have one of them is not gonna retain the property and be able to be expected to compensate the other spouse who's vacating the property with any kind of money, because if the balance is less than what they currently owe, hence being underwater, then there is no money, there's no equity to share, right? So all that's going to bring that back is time, right? Pretty much. So it honestly, a short sale situation is probably going to be better for both of them. But again, I'm more talking from my own personal opinion, because anytime you can own real estate, and especially if you have kids, you don't want to be moving them around if you don't have to. But if because of underwater short sale situation, it may be better just to stay in the home, make arrangements to continue to pay the mortgage, wait it out, let the value start to increase, and just it's going to be playing more of a long game. But you go short sale, you could be responsible for, if you sell the property for less than what you owe, you need to get approval from your lender, but you could also owe that money down the road as well. You're not just going to be able to walk away from being short, so to speak. So that's a tough one. It really is. And that's, you definitely, not only if you're going through that kind of situation, you might want to have a real estate attorney representing, the house, so to speak, whoever is going to, retain ownership, because they need to be able to work with the lender and, make sure things are going to be okay. So it's a tough situation for sure.
That definitely very tough, and
Yeah.
our listeners are definitely going to want to enlist someone with a lot of
Yeah.
experience as well on the short sale side, like you said, a real estate attorney. All right, so let's go with the last question of our session today. Can a prenuptial agreement affect the division of the home in a divorce?
Absolutely, because the way the prenup is read, it's a negotiation, but from the standpoint of who may be responsible depending on what happens is really going to be determined based on, is there a mortgage of the property, and how did the deed of the property get recorded? Because even though you might sign a prenup, and again, I'm not an attorney, so a prenup is just an agreement between two people that is authorized, or the blessings given by the court. But when it comes to owning a property, you have a personal promissory note to a creditor that says that you owe it. So just because you may not be responsible in a prenup situation, the mortgage company isn't going to say, oh, because you have a prenup, we're just going to let you off the hook. It doesn't work that way. So again, that's where you talk about, maybe if you're going to retain, you do a refi or you sell, and you don't have to worry about it then, because everything would be dissolved.
Right.
That was an easy
Well,
one.
excellent. Well, we appreciate your time again today, Marson. And
It's been
this
fun, man.
concludes our third day of the week here of our interview. Please join us tomorrow as we continue our discussion on mortgages and divorce. Believe it or not, there are more questions. And Marson and I would like to thank you for joining us today on the Breaking Ties interview series. Should you have any questions for Marson, you can find his contact information in the description of the podcast. And remember, divorce is not the end of your story. It is the start of your next great chapter. See you tomorrow. All right, welcome back to the Breaking Ties interview series. Today is day 4 of 5, and we are here with Marson Maynor, who is a loan officer with Geneva Financial and has a load of expertise in mortgages. How you doing today, Marson?
Doing fantastic, my friend. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good as well. Looking forward to the weekend here.
Yeah, man. Glad to be here. I appreciate it.
Yes, definitely. Well, I tell you, my listeners appreciate all the information you've said over the last 3 days. And if you're new to the podcast series today, I recommend you go back and you listen to the last 3 days so you get more information on mortgages during the divorce process and after the divorce. So today we're going to start with Probably a fairly obscure kind of question. What are the implications of a quitclaim deed in a divorce?
Um, Simple answer is you have two people that purchased the property, and now they're going to be giving up their ownership right to the property. So they would complete what's called a quitclaim deed. They'd be granting their ownership to the other person. They can transfer it to someone else, or they can just remove themselves, transferring titles solely into their spouse, and that's it. Now, that does not, though, if they did borrow the money together to buy the home, that does not negate them from still being personally responsible to pay back on the mortgage. All they're doing is just removing their name from the title, which means they no longer have an ownership interest in the property.
Oh,
Yeah.
all right.
Be
Very
careful.
interesting right there.
Don't quit claim ever if you are responsible for making a mortgage payment. Don't do that. Not
Right,
a good thing.
exactly.
Yeah.
So, for the quitclaim deed and value and stuff, should we hire an appraiser to assess the home's value? I mean, is that just standard practice?
You can. Um, it depends again. I mean, again, if you're going to do refinance, then the lender will order an appraiser, right? Or appraisal, I should say. If they're going to sell, you may want to contact a real estate agent. Reason being is you go get an appraisal. That appraisal is going to be it's subjective, right? Typically, when you have an appraisal done for the purposes of a purchase, they have a contract. They have other key factors that they can include in their justification of value once the actual appraisal inspection has been done. And they use that as a comparison to other similar homes in the local vicinity to the subject property to give a more clearly defined value than what just an appraisal may do. Because then if they're going to sell, they might actually be able to sell it higher for them what they necessarily got an appraisal for on their own. But it doesn't mean that it won't appraise, when it's under contract for a sale at a higher amount. So you're just better off if you're going to sell, start with a real estate agent, have them, help you with determining value. If you're going to refinance, talk with the lender and let them do the work. Don't go and just get that on unless you just need to know and you're like a data freak, which people are, then it's like $500. So it's up to you. It won't be
Right.
used for anything other than your own information. That's it.
All right. So we've talked a lot about if one spouse is going to stay in the property, they got to refinance the property. Can child support or spousal maintenance, i.e., alimony, be used for that qualification of the new mortgage?
Yes, but it depends. So it depends on a couple of things: the time at which it's, how long it's been going on. So if it's a new divorce situation and alimony and or child support are just now getting set up, that income couldn't be used if they needed to start their refinance right away at the time of the divorce being finalized. Okay, if one needs to have, like we've talked about before, removing their name, being not being responsible anymore. Well, it may be difficult for the spouse that's retaining the property to qualify on their own now if they're not having that additional income coming in from alimony and child support. And in order for that to work, depending on if it's a conventional loan and FHA loan, they each have their own, but there's waiting periods. So minimal waiting period is going to be somewhere about 6 months. And what that means is they're going to need to show proof of that income coming in. So typically just getting 6 months bank statements and show that income has been coming in. And that doesn't necessarily need to be on the divorce decree because you're looking at consistency. But where the hang up is now that income is coming in and being used, we need to also show now that it's going to continue for at least 3 years from the date of inception. So typically you would need a divorce decree that's now dictating that spouse that's responsible will continue to pay. So now if that child, let's say, is 17 years old, that is not going to continue on. And I know there's some things when kids are going to school, how that's going to be done through the divorce decree on paying additional, or not additional child support, but child support while they're maintaining college. That's going to be an as is, like an exception basis with an underwriter, because when they're 17, who's the guarantee that child's going to be going to school next year? We don't know. So there's a lot of unknowns at that point. It's hard to give you a specific answer. Just know that if they need to qualify with alimony or child support, 6 months minimum and at least 3 years of expected recurring income coming in after the fact.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, that's really great information right there. Appreciate that.
Why do they got to
So,
complicate everything so much, right?
yeah, right. Yeah. It can be, well, divorce is complicated anyway. So
I
this
know.
just
Let's
adds,
just add to it.
add to it.
Yeah.
So, well, hey, we're wrapping up here the fourth of 5 days. I'm
Nice.
having a great time.
Yeah, man.
This interview has been fantastic. I know we've got more questions tomorrow on our last day. So we
Okay.
ask everyone to join us again tomorrow as we continue our discussion on mortgages and divorce. Marson and
Yeah.
I would definitely like to thank you for joining us again. Hopefully you come back and see the rest in the finale of the interview series. Should you have any questions for Marson, feel free to look up his contact information in the description. And I always like to say, the divorce is not the end of your story. It is the start of your next great chapter. And we will see you tomorrow. Welcome to the fifth and final day of our week-long Breaking Ties interview series, where we have been talking with Marson Maynor about mortgages and the divorce process. I tell you, it's been a fantastic week, Marson. How do you think about it?
I like it, man. It's good to get the synapses firing off and testing this kind of knowledge, because this is not something that happens on an everyday basis. And but I know it's needed. It's people are not sure where to go, where they can turn, and I think you putting this out and providing a platform for them to get some answers that no judging, no nothing, man. It's just, this is what it is when you're going through this, and it's good to get the right info. So I think you're on the right track, putting some good stuff out there, man.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. And I tell
Yeah,
you, it's the information you've been provided. I mean, even I've learned a few things from your processes and how it works on your side. And
cool.
for those listeners who don't know, like I said, this is the fifth day. We have 4 other mortgage and divorce question and answer sessions through the previous 4 days. So go back, listen to them. You're going to get some great information. And really, Marson's been fantastic. And for those of you who are here the first time, Marson is a loan officer with Geneva Financial and has years of experience in mortgages. And it's really showing through this interview.
Huh. You seeing lines on my face or something, man? What are you talking about? No, I'm just kidding.
No, you're looking as suave as ever.
Right
This
on,
is what
man.
day 5 has come to, huh?
Yeah. Getting squirrely.
That's right. So, all right. Things that aren't squirrely, though, are these questions we got coming up, because
Right.
we got some really, really big questions here. And we're going to start it off with, how can someone remove their name from the mortgage after the divorce?
Oh, that's actually a really good question, and it's a pretty easy answer, actually. Just because you're dissolving your relationship with another person doesn't necessarily carry over to those assets that you might own together. And when it comes to a mortgage, which means you're going to have a loan against the house, creditors or lenders aren't that forgiving, if you will, because the more people that they can have on the hook or be responsible, the better chances they feel that they're going to be able to get their money paid in full, whether it's through a sale down the road or through the entire term of the loan. So they're not usually willing to just remove one of the spouses because they're getting a divorce. Like, hey, I'm not going to be living in the property anymore. We're going to sign a quitclaim deed to get me off the title, and I just can't, be responsible. Well, that's not their concern. Their concern is our mortgage going to get paid? Now, there are options to be able to do it, but just to simply call up your lender and ask them to remove doesn't hurt to try. I'm not saying not to do that, but chances are you're going to have to either sell the home or refinance, which means you need to remove that mortgage from your name. Bottom line.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It's never easy. The divorce process itself is never easy. So why would mortgage process be any different?
Yeah.
Now, when we look at finalizing the divorce process, as far as the house goes, is there any way the house is used as leverage for, say, the marriage settlement agreement?
It can, from a simple fact, and this might get we might go down a rabbit hole with the explanation, but the thing is there's equity in a home, even though a home is a liability. It also can be an asset. It's one of those things because it does gain in value, right? So it's an asset, and the debt typically decreases as the value increases. So it can be a powerful asset to leverage during a divorce situation because that equity could stay in the house if one of the spouses decides to stay in the home, and the other spouse that's vacating doesn't want to necessarily have any of that equity. They can use that as, hey, there's $200,000 of equity in the house. Instead of us doing X amount in alimony or X amount in child support, which I'm not a fan of any of that. I'm just saying it's all negotiable. But other assets, other like 401ks and retirement plans. I mean, it can get nuts out there with who gets what type of thing. So the house is just a part of that. You don't necessarily, unless you need the money, you don't necessarily need to do anything with the property. Just leave the equity in the home. You're not forced unless that's part of your divorce settlement, so to speak. So
Right.
that answer the question. I know it's a little roundabout, but I want to make sure nothing is like mandatory. It's like
Right.
everything is
No,
negotiated. It's like
exactly. Yeah. And so when you look at the assets, that's what this is. It gets divvied up with the rest of the assets, and it's
right,
negotiated through the attorneys for each particular client.
right.
So, but the house, like you said, it does have value.
Yeah.
Now, probably looks like our last question here. What happens if one of the spouses refuses to cooperate with the mortgage arrangements?
Well, they're going through a divorce, and there's going to be a court settlement. So the judge is going to have their final say, and if it comes down to the judge saying that one of the spouses has to do something versus not do it, it's that's a big part of it. But again, based on the mortgage, if one of the spouses says, "Look, I don't want the house anymore. I don't want to have anything to do with it. I want out. Buy me out, whatever," and the spouse that's retaining it cannot do it, there's nothing that can happen. The only thing that the spouse can do is sign a quit claim deed, which we talked in a previous session, but then that removes them from ownership of the property. And that doesn't protect them in the liability situation, because once you're no longer part of the house, trying to get any answers for the property is going to make it more difficult because you no longer own the house.
Right.
So it can be a very tricky, situation when it comes to that, because there's that. Does it make sense? Yes. There's $200,000 in equity. We should just split that 50-50. But affordability is something that most things don't usually come up in. Affordability comes up in the divorce discussion, but it's from the standpoint of, are we going to be able to have enough to pay for the kids, education, food, groceries, roof over the head, all that kind of stuff. Not from the standpoint of can I qualify to refinance or buy a new home? Like, that's not, the courts aren't going to look at that kind of thing. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? I think I might have expanded a little too far.
It's hard not to expand when there's so many different scenarios and facets of the
Yeah.
divorce process and how it works and functions and stuff. And so I think that's actually kind of a good way to end our week-long series, is the fact that it
Oh,
can go lots of different ways. There
yeah.
isn't one right solution for any divorce. It's going to depend
Mm-hmm.
on the conversations that are taking place between the two spouses getting divorced, the attorneys that are in the negotiating phase of things, and then the judge
Yeah.
giving the final stamp of approval.
Yeah.
So, it's just as challenging as the divorce itself when you got all sorts of debts and assets that you got to divvy up as well.
Yeah. Best thing to do is, just like, when you're contemplating, even thinking of a divorce, you hire an attorney, just like, you putting out all this great content for people to learn from. If they have those kind of assets and things, definitely talk with a financial advisor. So they do that. Home, definitely want to talk to a lender. They got to talk to their insurance agent. I mean, they've got to, they've got a lot to do, and they've got to talk to all those people that they've done jointly for so long, however long they've been married. where they only needed one lender, one insurance, one financial advisor, maybe one accountant, one attorney. Now everything is doubled, and you need to have your own representation, and you need to have somebody that you trust to be able to give you that information so that you know what your next steps are. So good job for putting
Right.
all this out, man. Good stuff.
Well, thanks. And hey, I want to thank you for coming on this week and sharing what you know with the listeners. Appreciate
Yeah,
that.
it was my pleasure.
So this ends our week-long interview series. If you've not seen the previous days, I would still highly recommend you go back and take a look at those because the questions are different every day. And so Marson and I, for the last time, are signing off on the week-long series of the Breaking Ties interview. Should you have any questions for Marson, his contact information is in the description of the podcast episode here. And keep in mind that divorce is not the end of your story. It is the start of your next great chapter. All the best, and we'll talk to you soon.
Take it easy.
We want to thank you for listening to this episode of Breaking Ties, Is Divorce the Answer? With Mike Fulkerson. For questions, please reach out to Mike via email in the description or give him a shout at 630-444-1410. And remember to subscribe, like, and follow.